仲立ちによりて
I'm Igor Oganesov. This is Japan. If you have a mind to, you can find Pearl Harbor on the streets of Tokyo. In a face, a lean, ascetic face, there is something we Americans will rarely comprehend. A strange sort of swordsmanship called iaido. Its purpose is to decapitate, disembowel, kill the opponent with a single blow. And the strangest part of this whole ritual is that the swordsman never studies defensive maneuvers. If he does not kill with a single attack, he does not know how to protect himself. What he is working on is himself. To draw that sword, to exclude all but attack from his mind, to reach the heart of discipline and then strike perfectly. This is one face of Japan. This lay behind Pearl Harbor, and it is still here. Of an afternoon, any afternoon, you can find something we Americans cannot comprehend. We draw the bow to hit the bullseye. In Japan, it doesn't matter much if he misses the target altogether, so long as he draws the bow properly, with correct form and concentration. What he is working on is himself, not the flight of the arrow. If we cannot understand the tension, equally we cannot understand the release from tension. Of an evening in a middle-class resort not far from Tokyo, the local accounting section of a Japanese firm, without their wives, checks into a hotel, modern as Miami. Down the neon-lit escalator, wearing summer kimonos, the businessmen move into Saturday night. And this is how some Westerners would like to think of Japan, wearing wooden sandals, exotic, with a thin veneer of Western culture. It all fits that stereotype of the Japanese. And we need only one more fact to dismiss the Japanese entirely. We need to see the imitation of the West. We are often so sure they are only imitators. Wearing a medieval kimono and a necktie, the drummer confirms our preconception. How can you draw the line of logic between the discipline of the swordsman and the release of a jazz tune played off key? The mark of our distance from Japan is that the average Westerner does not know the name of a single famous Japanese. The Japanese have a passion for anonymity and a greater passion to lose themselves in a crowd. Arthur Koestler once called the Japanese robots. Another writer once said, in the 21st century, we will all be Japanese. In the popular American mind, there is something distant, faintly sinister about these people. One of the happier events between us and the Japanese was the appointment of Edwin Reischauer as American ambassador to Japan. Ambassador Reischauer and his wife served for 5 years. He is now a professor at Harvard again, and he shares few of the stereotypes we've been discussing for the last few minutes. Professor Reischauer.
We Americans have been transfixed with China and with our problems in Vietnam for so long that we often forget about Japan. We seem to take it for granted. Think of this, 100 million Japanese produce almost as much wealth as all the rest of Asia put together. In a very real sense, Japan is the great power of Asia. What happens between us and the Japanese is sure to be more important to us in the long run than what happens in Vietnam or even in our relations with China. What this film is really about is how the Japanese live and how well they solve their problems. In studying the Japanese, you'll have to eat a little intellectual spinach. It's good for you. There are 100 million Japanese. There are 200 million Americans. The United States ranks first in gross national product. Japan ranks third, well behind us and the Russians, but ahead of Germany, England, and France. Japan's rate of growth is faster than any other major nation. If she keeps up her present rate, she'll come close to us and the Russians by the 21st century. As a small example, Japan can deliver steel in Los Angeles cheaper than Pittsburgh can. And the reason is not the cheapness of labor. It's that the Japanese steel industry is on the whole more advanced than ours. How did Japan do it? How did she raise herself from defeat in World War II and virtual starvation to her present position in the world? The answer lies in the Japanese character, the subject of this study. Let's start with what's at hand, a room in a Japanese inn. The contrast between Japan and America reveals itself instantly by what the Japanese feel is luxurious. Since Japan is one of the most crowded nations on Earth, space is the greatest luxury. Japan is built for efficiency of space. America is built for efficiency of time. In order to maintain psychological distance from one another, the Japanese have invented all sorts of conventions which may seem strange at first glance. For instance, they pretend that those sliding paper screens are real walls. Early in life, the Japanese learn that what happens on the other side of a closed screen is not to be noticed. Though the sound may leak from one room to another, a Japanese hears nothing unless he's invited in.
ごめんください。
どうぞ。
The compartments of Japanese life are like the compartments of a Japanese house. Within the same individual, each part of life is separated off from the other parts. All this grew out of Japan's tremendous overcrowding. The Japanese are jammed on top of each other in a way we're just beginning to experience in parts of our country. When you're packed as tightly as this, somehow you have to invent compartments. As one body presses against another, the only decent way to maintain privacy is to pretend the other person isn't there. All nations have their pretenses, their basic myths. We Americans pretend we're all individualists, sons of pioneers, frontiersmen, and cowboys. The Japanese pretenses are different, but perhaps more useful. What the Japanese have to do is to pretend that a lot of things which are there are not there. The puppet theater shows this very simply. The men who are not supposed to be there are wearing black, and the audience is not supposed to see them. It all seems so strange to Americans. The impassive face of the puppeteer, the wailing voice of the single man on the side who plays all the parts. This man's voice has been officially established as a cultural treasure. On stage, 3 levels of reality. You're not supposed to see the men in black at all. You're only half supposed to see the chief puppeteers. What you're really supposed to see is the puppets. And after a while, that's all you do see. Americans sometimes say that the Japanese are impassive, almost doll-like. But the human heart is the same everywhere. To be human is to be emotional, and the Japanese are very human and very emotional. The rule is, don't show your emotions. Keep your feelings to yourself. The Japanese come to the theater to see displays of emotion that the members of the audience would never allow themselves. I can assure you that every emotion that has ever touched an American heart has touched a Japanese. We may find the Japanese exotic, but to them we're equally exotic. That's why many of the mannequins in a Japanese department store have blue eyes, blonde hair, and only the faintest Japanese cast to their eyes. When you look around a department store, you begin to feel the Japanese have been copying us. But actually, the Japanese invented the department store long before we did. We met a couple in this store, a Mr. and Mrs. Imai. We asked them if we could watch them and their family for a few days, and they agreed. Mr. Imai is a little more outgoing. Mrs. Imai is typically timid. There was some reluctance when we suggested we'd like to come to their suburban home and film a gathering of the whole family. Things were a little stiff at first. Then normality began to ricochet around the table, and we began to see how a Japanese family really works. In theory, Japanese families are patriarchies. Mr. Imai wears a kimono at home, and he looks as if he runs a show. Mrs. Imai really runs the house. She just never says she does. The older son is quiet and reserved. The discipline of Japanese life has already gone to work on him. The younger son has not yet felt the pressures. The Japanese let children run reasonably free until about 11. The youngest niece is the darling of the family. What she wants, she gets. Young Japanese children are given freedom that even Dr. Spock might find excessive. The sister and brother-in-law are restrained as visitors and younger relatives. The grandparents have entered what is known as honorable retirement. The interweave of authority and love is not too different from an American family. The authority is perhaps stronger in the Japanese family. The two periods of personal freedom are childhood and old age. In between, the rules of society exert strong pressures. On the surface, this looks like a family dinner in America, except that everyone is sitting on the floor. It's not quite what we're used to, but all very natural to the Japanese. Grandfather Imai sings a traditional song about trees and water. The Japanese aren't afraid to improve on nature. In their gardens, every tree, every rock, the whole landscape, in fact, has been set there by someone's hand. To the American eye, this seems like a natural forest, but these are not trees that have grown that way by chance. It's a bonsai, a miniature tree, a gnarled old giant, but made small enough to have in your room. By stresses and wires, the tree has been dwarfed and twisted. The essence of the tree isn't lost. The miniature maples will change color with the seasons, shed their leaves in the fall, and come out again in the spring. All people everywhere are shaped by the unseen wires of society. The problem is it's hard to see what's working on you and easy to see what's working on others. What we propose to do is trace out some of the unseen wires working on the Imai family. We'll start with the children. Hiroshi Imai, age 9, is on his way to the earliest lesson in discipline and authority, his own written language. It's been said that the great difference between Japanese education and ours is that in Japan you are not liberated by education, you succumb to it. The force that makes him submit is not the teacher, but the Japanese writing system. We need only 26 letters to write anything in English, but Japanese high school graduates must learn how to read and write about 1,800 characters, and it takes twice as many to read the sort of books you get in college. This is a character of only average difficulty. Some are much more complex. It's a word for hope. In a sense, the Japanese spend their whole lives learning to read and write. The psychological result of all this submission to discipline may be a greater acceptance of authority than we have. It's not enough just to know how to read and write all these symbols. The Japanese think a good handwriting is a mark of refinement and character, so elegance and style count too. But one thing you will find throughout Japanese life, at the point where the discipline seems almost inhuman, the Japanese know how to find an emotional release from its tyranny. Hiroshi is writing the character for big, but he isn't very good at it yet. At home, Mrs. Imai is writing characters which are not only words, but a calligraphic painting as well. She's practicing her characters to refine her character. Thus, just at the point where the tree would break because of pressure, the Japanese let up. The Japanese design for living makes them disciplined to the point of compulsion. When they finally let loose, life becomes art. The largest advertising agency outside of America is in Japan. Mr. Imai is a minor official earning a little over $100 a week, with some interesting fringe benefits we'll talk about later on. He has a job for life. Japanese firms rarely fire their employees. But at about age 40, they'll make a basic decision. If he's good, he'll go into the power structure. Otherwise, he'll stay in a minor job until they retire him. The position of Japanese women was almost feudal until the end of the war. Mrs. Imai has little desire to be more than a housewife, but in recent years, many Japanese women have started to move into the man's world. While some women get glamorous jobs, the fact is that, like us, Japanese men do not look kindly on job competition from women. One large electric firm tried to set a mandatory retirement age for women at 25, on the basis that they should be married by that age. The public outcry made the firm reconsider. The epitome of femininity is the tea ceremony, an elaborate ritual based on Zen concepts. It's another form of self-discipline. You don't just pour the hot water on the tea. The manner in which the ladle is held shows the breeding and gentility of the hostess. This is part of a school for brides. Most Japanese women prepare themselves studiously for marriage. It takes almost 2 hours for the ceremony to be performed properly. This is hardly instant tea. Japan used to be an agricultural nation, and many attitudes derive from that time. Traditionally, Japanese women worked in the fields with the men, and they do even more of the heavy work now, and so many men have left the farms for factory jobs in the cities. The rice harvest now is women's work. Traditionally, the Japanese farmer is conservative, but not in American sense of rugged individualism. Conservatism means working within the group. Our kind of rugged individualism strikes them as a sort of neurosis. In American eyes, the most put-upon person in Japanese society is a woman, the wife, Mrs. Imai. A Japanese man once told me, a wife should be like the air you breathe. You can't do without it, but you don't think about it much. Her husband won't be home for dinner. She doesn't expect him. The people who do expect him are preparing his dinner. A good part of what the Japanese eat is eaten raw. To Americans, raw vegetables are one thing, but raw fish is another. Take my word for it, though, it's very good. Raw tuna, but you can expect raw sea bass, raw flounder, and raw squid. This is the feast Mr. Imai is heading for. Mrs. Imai knows where her husband is going, and a stag dinner is just the beginning. She puts up with it because marriages in Japan are seldom made purely for love. They're made more for children and the home. Mr. Imai stays out not only for business, but for male companionship. His social life centers on his office group. Business is one compartment, his family is another. Mrs. Imai really wants her husband to take her out, but she knows he won't. One Japanese woman told my wife, if my husband came home at 6 o'clock, I'd be afraid he was a failure. Nobody's really sure what the absence of their fathers does to Japanese children, but the Japanese do suffer from an even greater generation gap than we do. At this age, the Imai sons don't expect to see much of their father. They do their duty, their homework. Mr. Imai feels neither shame nor guilt about his nights on the town. Custom supports his moral code. The tax laws actually underwrite nightlife in Japan. Business is permitted to write off $1.5 billion a year for parties in restaurants, bars, and cabarets. That's more than Japan spends for higher education. These bar hostesses are more or less modern geisha girls. They're not prostitutes, as most Americans think. You might call them Japanese bunnies. The Japanese invented the idea of the Playboy Club centuries ago. If you ask Mr. Imai what he gets from these girls, he'd probably say good conversation. They let him think he's witty, charming, and an important man. The reason Mr. Imai can feel so easy with these girls is because he has no responsibilities towards them. He won't indulge to excess. He has enough responsibilities already. This is one of the fringe benefits that goes with a $100 a week salary. He just signs the company's name to the tab. That's the system, and a lot of jobs depend on it. More than 300,000 hostesses work in such establishments in Tokyo alone. If Mrs. Imai didn't feel neglected, she wouldn't be human. But because she's Japanese, she doesn't feel threatened. She knows he won't make a dangerous emotional attachment to anybody else. She waits and watches a Japanese equivalent of an American variety show. Incidentally, the girl who's singing doesn't speak English or understand it. She's just memorized the sounds phonetically. It's sheer memory work, like learning those thousands of characters. Things, of course, are changing. Future Mrs. Imais may not be willing to stay home, but this is the way it is now. A good Japanese wife isn't supposed to go to sleep until her husband returns, no matter how late. He might be hungry. He might even want to talk to her. Once in a rare while, he might bring home some of his friends for a final nightcap. I'm sure that most American wives watching this whole situation are thoroughly infuriated. When Mr. Imai comes home, he slips into his kimono and also back into his family. The family comes before all else, for him and for her. The proper Japanese husband and the proper Japanese wife. So here again is the recurring theme of the puppet theater, compartmentation, ignoring what is not to be seen. There is no guilt. There is no accusation. The thing that stands between us and the Japanese is not great geographic distance, but the fact that we don't share a common history. America is linked to Europe by a Judeo-Christian tradition that really goes back to the golden age of Greece. We've only known about Japan for the last century or so. So when the Japanese do things differently from the way we do, we call them exotic or strange. When they do things our way, we call them copiers. The fact is, the Japanese are a lot more than just adapters. They're skilled innovators. What they've done is to create their own version of the 20th century. The reason they're able to absorb Western influence so well is that they've never lost their own roots. They know exactly who they are. They're always Japanese. In psychological terms, they find their identity in the group far more than we do. It's easier to show all this than talk about it. We're using the puppet theater as a symbol to show how the Japanese mind works. They don't believe much in improvisation. They believe success is a result of careful group work rather than personal inspiration. It takes 10 years to learn how to manipulate the left hand of a bunraku-da. Another 10 years of training before the puppeteer takes over the head and body. Each puppeteer must know exactly what the other is going to do. Otherwise, the doll would move awkwardly. Backstage, this becomes a kind of ballet. The Japanese feel most secure while working in a group. There's something specifically Japanese in all this. For if the project falters, the blame falls not on the individual, but on the group as a whole. To be personally blamed for something is about the worst thing that can happen. More than any people I know, the Japanese are culturally conditioned to work together. They're always at their best when they're working with other people. The judgment of the group takes the place of the conscience of the individual. Religion. Americans always assume that Orientals are more mystic and spiritual than we are. That's not true for the Japanese. A second mistake we make is to read our concepts into their religions. For us, religion puts morality into our daily lives. For the Japanese, even these Japanese entertainers who've come to a temple between shows, religion is something more casual. It may be comforting, it may be refreshing, even fun, but it doesn't affect their daily lives. Japanese morals come from someplace else than heaven. The point of going to a temple is just to establish a momentary communion with a superior being. The Japanese attitude to their gods is respectful, brief, and practical. Some still believe that rubbing smoke from incense on their bodies helps cure ailments. Neither morality nor political philosophy derives from religion. What does come from it is sociability and emotional release. One way the Japanese get involved in religion is during the hundreds of small local festivals. These Shinto festivals don't have much religious content from our point of view. It may look fanatical, but all that's happening is that the boys are having a good time. Again, the Japanese are letting themselves go in a group in a way they would never let themselves go as individuals. The fact that Japanese religions have little to do with morality is something difficult for us to understand. What keeps a Japanese society in check if there are no commandments and morality doesn't derive from God? What keeps these people in check is not the sense of guilt before God, but shame before their fellow men. A parent disciplines a child not by saying this is wrong, but by saying people will laugh at you. Sin is not the same for them as it is for us. The greatest sin in Japan is to violate the social codes. Unlike America, the family doesn't protect the child from the scorn of society. It blames the child for having brought shame on the family. It praises the child for having brought honor to the family. Thus, the Japanese arrive at virtue by a different road than we do, but they do arrive there. Japan has less crime than any major nation of the Western world. This conformism can take place only if society is stable. The Japanese have had hundreds of years to work out their rules of social conduct. For over 1,000 years, there's been almost no immigration. The average Japanese goes through life without ever meeting anyone else but other Japanese. In sum, these are an isolated people who see everyone else in Japan as a member of the same big family.
The Japanese have lived together under crowded conditions for a very long time, and so they've developed extremely precise rules for dealing with each other. It's a whole encyclopedia of manners and forms of politeness, covering every possible situation, no matter how complicated or unpleasant. The rules are much more complex and rigid than anything we're used to. That's why Japanese traveling in the Western world is likely to feel a little uncomfortable, as if he'd wandered into a barbecue wearing a full-dress suit.
One thing you can be sure of, between Japanese and Japanese, there's always a bow. The bow is the exterior sign of their rigid social code. Now, when a miniskirt, a kimono, a student, and an executive meet, there seems to be a lot of aimless bobbing up and down. Or when you see a pretty girl bowing to a red telephone, you begin to wonder what it all means. But there's some very precise rules to bowing. As I've been saying, Japan is a country where nothing between people is left to chance. There are rules underlying all social behavior. For the anatomy of bowing, let's watch these two businessmen greeting each other. The man on the right gets down first and lowest. He's adopted what the Japanese call low posture. He's being overly modest. This forces the man on the left to try to take an even lower posture. Because the situation is uncomfortable, the bowing starts again. The man on the right relents and lets his companion go lower. They're each watching the other. That's why they don't bow head on. One must never be caught upright while the other is on the way down. The conversation is really unimportant. The bow gives an exact measure of social distance between people. The worst thing that any Japanese can say about another is that he behaved unpredictably. If you stick to prescribed form, you can't make a mistake. Into this land which swears by formality and homogeneity came we Americans, who swear by informality and individualism. The result of all this swearing is cultural shock.
That she will call me Mama. ママとも呼んでくれる。
On a more serious level, English, mostly American style, is Japan's second language. Most Japanese study our language in school for 6 years. I wish I could report that the level of English is high. It isn't. But what is at a high level is the intensity with which the Japanese struggle with the problems they have to solve. Watch this scene. Not for the English, but for the concentration of effort.
But she couldn't do that. Why? Why?
Because her father.
No, her mother.
Because her mother is
Japan's motto ought to be, we try harder.
sick
No.
before.
When she got better, she would hear Eleanor read every day. Why?
Because she's
When all this beautiful intensity gets unleashed, you can see deeply into the heart of the Japanese character. The camera has not been tricked. This is a normal speed and intensity at which Munakata, a famous woodblock artist, works. Americans used to confuse this intensity with fanaticism, particularly when the end product was foreign to our tastes. But in things that are familiar to us, for example, the struggle to enter a top university, the same intensity is again visible. These anxious young men are awaiting the results of the competitive examination for entrance into Tokyo University, the most prestigious university in Japan. This is an especially tense moment in Japanese life. When the lists are posted, the numbers tell more than which students will be accepted. They indicate which young men will be the future leaders of Japan. Up until a century ago, the Japanese had a feudal society in which birth determined a man's place. But since then, Japan has become a country in which success is based almost entirely on education. Acceptance in the right university has become so important, it's one of the few times the Japanese break all rules of conduct and permit themselves public joy or grief. Students who are not accepted will on occasion commit suicide. Others will try again and again at the same university and won't settle for a lesser college. This doesn't mean docility once they're accepted. Dissent plays as large a part in Japanese life as it does in ours. Students demonstrate in Japan for much the same reason they riot in America, in protest against Vietnam, middle-class values, and outdated university systems. The Japanese student has been at it longer than his American counterpart. Serious rioting began about 10 years ago, when the Japanese-American Security Pact was being ratified. It is widespread again now and can be expected to grow worse next year, when the treaty is up for review. The helmets make these protests look a lot fiercer than what we're accustomed to. The fact is that in 10 years of serious rioting, only 3 people have been killed, all of them by accident. The Japanese bring the same serious professionalism to disorder as they do to all their other activities. After months of violence, students of Tokyo University occupied one of the administrative buildings. As one watches the fracas, some of the social themes we've been talking about are illustrated. Organization and restraint are evident on both sides. The police are armed defensively. Their weapons shoot only water. The police tactic in this strike was to wash the students away. That's water being dropped from the helicopter. The more closely one looks, the more evident it becomes that this is a masterpiece of organization and restraint. Police power and student power are not meeting each other with raw force. I should say that by the time the students started using Molotov cocktails, the only students left were the extreme elements of the Zengakuren, a group so far out that the communists are, by comparison, conservatives. Escalation to Molotov cocktails finally brought out police tear gas. The end was predictable. Everyone knew that the students would be dislodged from the building. But the point is that they had to be allowed to lose with dignity. That's a very Japanese theme, and the reason for this whole sequence. You must always avoid disgracing your opponent. So, between the white flag of surrender and the moment before the police arrest the rioters, there's time allowed for the demonstrators to sing the Internationale. This showy, splashy demonstration is the sort of thing that substitutes for news from Japan. We fail to notice how ceremonious and professional the riot really is. Each side allows the other to maintain its self-respect. The same rule is supposed to apply to politics. The Japanese character in many ways is well suited to democracy. Japan started developing a parliamentary democracy 80 years ago and has moved steadily in this direction, except during the 1930s, when the military captured the government. This single disastrous slip led to a defeat in war as severe as any nation has ever suffered. Since then, they've renounced militarism and re-embraced democracy with a passion we might well envy. Their system has a typically Japanese flavor. They believe the views of the minority should be respected. The ruling party is supposed to take into account the demands of their opponents. Consensus is what they're after, not just simple majority rule. Grassroots politics are much the same in Japan as in the United States. Their politicians go through the same rituals as ours. The country is ruled by a conservative coalition which has held power for 20 years. There's a good reason for this conservative rule. Japan has been doubling its income every 5 or 6 years. With that kind of success, the conservatives are likely to go on winning elections for some time to come. The basic idea of the conservatives is the same as Calvin Coolidge. The business of government is business. They view almost all their problems as solvable by economic means. Such materialism may not seem very oriental to us. But since they spend relatively little on military arms, they've been winning one economic victory after another. What the Japanese have done is to take a land poor in natural resources, but with a highly educated, hard-working population, and make fine quality, low-priced products. We tend to dismiss the Japanese success in electronics as little men making little things. But in shipbuilding, the Japanese have taught the whole world a lesson. The Japanese captured the tanker market by outstudying the European shipyards. The British were putting in 3 hours of paperwork for each hour of actual shipbuilding. The Japanese went to 9 hours of computerized detailed study and cut down on the cost of assembling. The result is that the market is theirs. They're building the biggest and most efficient cargo ships in the world. Of course, shipbuilding fits the island tradition of Japan. Like the British, they live or die by ocean routes. Yet the Japanese have succeeded in many fields that are new to them. Japan has become the world's leading maker and exporter of pianos. This for a nation that hadn't heard Western music a century ago. The idea of success by working in groups extends all the way down through kindergarten. The mass teaching of young violinists by Shinichi Suzuki has become a breakthrough in musical training. a Suzuki group of children between 5 and 7 years old, though they start as young as 3. The point is that if a child can learn the sounds of his own language by 3, he can learn music at the same age. The method of training is so successful that many major American music schools have copied it. There's something that makes Westerners vaguely uneasy about hearing Bach played by Orientals. I mean, Bach is so American, he ought to belong to us alone. More seriously, there's a great shortage of string players in major American orchestras. We've already begun to import Japanese violinists for our symphonies. Perhaps someday one of these young Suzuki-trained musicians will be a concertmaster. We'll know where to go if America ever needs a left-handed fiddler who learned to bow early and who has an itch here or there. The lesson Japan offers the world is that to be successful, to be modern, a nation doesn't have to be Western. Every nation can make its own version of a modern society. It also ought to comfort us to know that there are 100 million Japanese, twice the size of France, whose social goals are closely parallel to ours. The most powerful nation in Asia is linked to us not as a follower or an imitator, but as a partner and an equal. I said to begin this broadcast, what happens between us and the Japanese is far more important than what happens between us and the Chinese or the Vietnamese. The Japanese admit they've learned much from us. Perhaps it's time that we studied them a lot more carefully. They've faced the problems of crowding and overpopulation without losing their sense of human values. It stands to reason that we may have something to learn here. And when the rest of Asia moves into the 20th century, the countries of the East may turn more naturally to the Japanese than to us. In the history of nations, there sometimes occurs a stage which later generations look back to as a golden age. It's a time when a nation exerts an influence on its neighbors and on the future far out of proportion to its actual size or wealth. Japan may be entering such a golden age right now. I'm Edwin Reischauer. Good night.
CBS News has presented The Japanese with Edwin Reischauer.